Let's move into our next segment about the Space Force. And as I mentioned, there's been a huge revitalization of private and government investment in what we're now calling essentially the new era of space. If you get the National Defense Magazine, for example, they have a number of great articles on that in this month's edition, and it's been, it's lots of articles you can find both online as well as just traditional print media around kind of everything that's happening in space. And lots of innovation is really driving it off the ultimate high ground. And we're going to now welcome retired Colonel Richard Reaser to share his experience and insights from a very illustrious career. Rick is currently actually consulting both for the DoD and the Air Force, as well as private industry, and has also been one of our executive advisors and friends at SMA for many years. Rick was formerly the chief engineer of the Navstar GPS Joint Program Office, as well as Deputy Systems Program Director. So welcome, Rick. So there's Rick. Fantastic.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is the Space Force and what's going on with the space organization stuff. And I'll give you a little context for this. I was involved with Doug Lavero and a couple other people. Actually, I was kind of his person to when in 2000, there was a series of commissions that came out. One was on the National Reconnaissance Office, another one was on the Space Commission. So at that time, over 20 years ago, there's a group of us that sort of looked at what do we really want to do with organizing space. And at that time, we were promoting having a space force 20 years ago, and it was called a space cadre, a space corps, lots of different things that came up about that. But the real issue that was that started all this was two things basically. One was that the budget for space was continually being attacked by the other parts of the Air Force, because the space was primarily in the Air Force, and so a lot of the money was going to other places. And so space really didn't have its own place, and so the space people thought that ought to change. The other thing that was going on was that when the space program first started, it was really driven by innovation, development, R&D, and requirements that were based on what people thought you needed, not necessarily somebody going through some detailed analysis about what was required to do the war, but basically it revolved around how things were perceived by the development community. So it was really a technology push space operation that we had the first, basically 40 years of the space program. And what had happened was that they had formed this new thing called the Air Force Space Command in the Air Force, and it was primarily dominated by missile launch officers. So they took all the ICBM forces, and they moved that into one thing. So a lot of it was dominated by that. So part of the idea back then was to try to come up with a new way of doing space, force it more into development. And then the other thing had to do with kind of a Star Trekian view of the world. And I think the feeling was that everybody who was in the space business needed to really understand the technology of space and how things worked and all that. And it wasn't like other sources where you had an operator that really didn't have to understand anything about how the system worked and how it's developed and how to maintain it, but they basically just executed, fired the gun or shot the cannon or something like that. So that's sort of what happened. So over the next 20 years, this idea had been talked about by several things. It started in the Obama administration where they took a little bit of seriousness about it. And then finally in the Trump administration, he decided to do Space Force. So basically, it wasn't exactly how people envisioned it to begin with, and it may not be the way it ends up in the future. But essentially, what happened was they created this first slide. They created this thing called Space Force, like the Marine Corps, but it would be like a separate service underneath the Air Force, and that's how it was started. And that was about 2 years ago that happened. So that's what it is. It's a new branch of the military within the Department of the Air Force. So we didn't get away from things like having the budget, exactly extracted away from the Air Force. The Air Force is still somewhat in charge of it and also in charge of acquisition. I'll talk about that later, but so we have a bit of a hybrid. And so this has been taking a long time to actually get birthed. And I'll go through a little bit about that. It's taken a while to get it organized. So next slide. So like I said, the original reason we went on Space Force had to do primarily with, merging the acquisition part and the operations part and having things defined by technical things. And this time, I think it was driven by other kinds of things. And most of it had to do, I think, with things like we talked about spaces under threat. So you see this rising Chinese and Russian space things going on, the rest of the world to do that. So they basically said, well, in order to figure out how to counter that, we need to have our own space force and be able to do that. And so you can sort of read some of the things on the slide. So basically it took all the things we're doing in space and put them into a single command. It was kind of that way before, but and then a lot of the focus has been in terms of developing ways to counter an adversary's actions against us in space, which is not what originally was thought of as what we needed to do. But with the politics of such, with China and the rising things and their demonstrations, that sort of forces down that path. And so that's kind of where it happened. So basically, they put all that stuff into one command, and it's basically the same stuff I had before. You can read about that on the slide. Next slide. And that's how it was justified. So basically, what had happened was right at the end of the Trump administration, they came out with this Space Policy Directive 4, and it sort of laid out what they wanted to have happen in the space forums. And you can sort of read those things, but with the idea of consolidating everything in military space activities and create career tracks. That was one of the things we were trying to do early on 20 years ago, was to have kind of a consolidated career track. We actually already had that. I was a space vehicle ops director when I was a lieutenant, and I worked in a program office, and I was also running contracts and doing technology and those kind of things. And so we kind of had that before, and then it kind of drifted apart into an operational track and an acquisition track and an S&T track, and they're trying to revolve it. And that kind of gets back into Star Trek further, because if you look at Star Trek, the only guy who didn't seem to be a PhD in engineering was Worf, the security officer. The rest of the guys were all, brain surgeons, of really, really smart people. Everybody on the crew is that way, and they all could actually kind of do other people's jobs, except maybe in the original Star Trek, the Dr. McCoy sort of complained about that, but he was still a pretty smart guy. So basically, what ended up happening was, and I think you'll read a lot of things that people took exception to this, but they basically just redesignated the thing and renamed stuff and kept it kind of in place and created this other thing and gave it a new name and new uniforms and new organizational names of things. And then they tried to merge the space acquisition stuff, which is really one of the, at the time when this was set up, the most broken part of space is how you buy stuff. And so they said, well, we're going to try to consolidate that, and you'll see later, it's not clear if they really consolidated that, but they did do some consolidation. So that's kind of what happened when they set it up. So next slide. So this basically tells what they're supposed to do. A lot of it has to do with protection of interest in space, which kind of gets into space counter force. In years prior, a lot of what went on, and by the way, most of the functions that they still have to do with none of these things. They have to do with supporting people on the ground with information and services from space, which is kind of missing from this chart, which is kind of interesting to me. But now it's sort of in this warfighting thing, like wars in space, where really 95% of what they do is give weather information, do communications, navigation, warn against attacks of land-based things and those kind of things. But the focus was basically this things up at the top, deter aggression, into and from space and protect interests in space. So that's why you see a lot of this stuff in the press about we're gonna reveal our big space weapon pretty soon. They've been kind of putting that off. You probably read about that in the press. And that was one of the articles that was in Defense News. So, but if you look at all the things that we actually do, well, we launch satellites and we do command and control. We warn against missiles. We keep track of things in space so they don't hit each other. And none of those are warfighting functions. They support warfighting, but they whatever. So next slide. So here's one of the hardest things, and I elicited the support of SMA on this, and they gave me some information, but finding an organization chart for how it's organized has got to be one of the toughest problems. It's probably tougher than standing up Space Force, is finding an org chart for it. So this chart's probably a year and a half old. It's fairly correct. And I got it from Doug Lavero, who's another person that we work with a lot, and a lot of, I can see my former boss when this all kicked off 20 years ago. So basically, the way it's set up is they have called Chief of Space Operations, sort of like the Chief of Staff of the Air Force or the Commandant Marine Corps. This person, Jay Raymond, is a 4-star general. He's in the Pentagon. And so the headquarters of this thing is in the Pentagon. And then there are what they call 3 field commands, and those are the Space Operations Command. That essentially is the renamed Air Force Space Command in Colorado Springs. Space Systems Command is the renamed Space and Missile Systems Center in Los Angeles. And STARCOM is kind of a new thing which has to do with that's where they do their training and readiness and those kinds of functions, but primarily training functions and getting things ready for whatever. So that's kind of a new thing, although they had training squadrons and all that kind of stuff and so forth. So, and one of the big efforts over the past year has been reassigning and changing the names of all these things and putting them in this org chart that's very difficult to find. The bases really haven't changed. They have stuff in the same places in LA, Vandenberg, and the Cape and so forth. One other organizational change they made was they went back to the future and they merged all the launch operations and the launch acquisitions into a single place. It used to be that way before. It was called, it had several different names for it. SAMTO, SAMTech used to be where we actually used to do a lot of that stuff. And they had sort of control over the launch range and stuff like that. So that kind of went back to what it was. They also gave up the new names of things. So we're going to have like squadrons, groups, and wings and things like, or regiments like the Army and the Navy does. They're going to call them deltas. So a delta is sort of like a wing, I guess. And so that's what Del means. So they see a bunch of deltas there, but there's just basically another name for a person who's a colonel that's in charge of something. So the other thing that they did was they had set up recently this thing called the Space Warfighting Analysis Center. And it doesn't appear on this slide. In fact, you can't find it on any org chart, but I did find the biography of the guy who's the deputy commander, and apparently general's in charge. It's in the Pentagon. So basically the Space Warfighting Analysis Center is in the Pentagon. And I'm gonna talk more about it at that very end, because that's one of the things that they've kind of done. They've mixed up the way they think about and the way they buy things and so forth. Now, this just does, as in the previous slide, just organize, train, and equip stuff. It doesn't really execute anything or fight the war. The war actually part of it is actually fought and the services are executed by another new organization called United States Space Command, which I think is the next slide. Should be. There it is. So we used to have a United States Space Command, and it was right across the street from the Air Force Space Command. And I had the privilege of working in both organizations for Don Katina, who took me with him when he moved over across the street. And basically that was sort of like a way to have an internal conflict at one single Air Force base where people fought with each other about who's in charge. And so that hasn't changed one bit. So we've actually gone back to the future again. So we have the people that are actually in charge of the mission, the combatant commanders, and he's an Army guy that does this, Commander Dickinson. And I went to a conference last week, and the first thing he did was talk about what's the difference between Air Force Space Command and US Space Command. I have a slide about that later, but we're kind of back to fighting the old arguments about what exactly people do, because we maybe have too many organizations that have 4-stars in charge of them. So essentially the way they execute the forces is through this wiring diagram, which has, the defense of stuff, and then the real mission of space, which is to give other combatant commanders things. One thing they make a big deal out of is, well, now we're going to be a supported thing. So people are going to support us. We're not just supporting other people. I have yet to see exactly what that is, but they make a big point of that. We're just as good of a sync as anybody else, and we do the same things, and you support us, we support you, and blah blah blah, kumbaya. So anyway, these people are in charge of executing it. It's sort of like like let's say PACOM. PACOM has, so they get all their forces from other places, from the services, and they put that together and they go fight wars with it. And that's kind of what happens here. Same idea. Next slide. So this talks about it, and then this goes back, and this is just sort of out of the Goldwater Nichols, but basically, and they will probably argue about this slide till they don't have Space Command anymore, but the services, organize, train, equip, and combatant commands do the warfighting integrated space ops, and they sort of show the difference. The problem in space is there really isn't that much difference between these two things. Like I said, I was this ops director when I was in a program office. I helped, plan all the missions. We did all the provision of the navigation services. I was in GPS at the time when I was doing this. And so it hasn't really, there's not that much, difference between them. And then Space Force does a lot of things because they're well funded and resourced that probably should be done by US Space Command, and that will be a continual point of argument, just like it was back when we had Space Command before, and I used to be in that organization. Next slide. Now, in the overall context, now all this stuff, down in the military part has to fit in with what goes on in the rest of the Pentagon, which is run by a bunch of civilians. So this chart attempts to show how complicated that is. And so what's happening now is that other departments of the Navy and the Army, they're now chopping over some of their missions, like the Army's communication terminal control thing, and then the Navy has a SATCOM program that's being chopped over to these other things. But essentially, like everything else, the Secretary of Defense and his staff is really in charge of all this stuff because that's civilian control of the military. So this sort of shows how that all fits into everything, and at the end of the day, the Secretary of Defense, the President are actually in charge of all this, and they have their own staffs laid on top of all this stuff that tend to tell them what to do, what they get away with, and so forth. So that's kind of how this all fits together within the various departments. And like I said, if you look at the Air Force slide, it's like the Marine Corps. They have the Air Force, instead of the Marine Corps, they have a space operations corps or whatever run by General Raymond, and then the other Air Force stuff, and they provide a lot of services and so forth to the Space Force. In fact, a lot of what goes on, not everybody's going to be in Space Force. Like all the civilians in Space Force, they're not even in Space Force. They're part of the Air Force right now. Not sure that's a great idea, and that was not the idea we had 20 years ago. But that's the way it is, and so they'll use the same personnel system. They'll drift in and out of Space Force and all that, and which is kind of an interesting because a lot of the space now is dominated by civilians and not military people in terms of numbers. Next slide. The acquisition structure is the most screwed up of anything right now. And this slide, any slide that has this many dotted lines, arrows, and different colors of arrows demonstrates just how messed up this is. And so they're continuing to do this. And this was in the NDAA, and now the Congress itself is now picking apart how they think it ought to be organized. And the House Appropriations Committee, if you can read this in Space News, they just railed on this. All you did was rename everything. You didn't change anything. And the whole idea, or one of the main ideas of this, was to fix acquisition. In the conference I went last week, the Space Warfighting Integration Forum, every panel said the most screwed up thing about space is acquisition. I mean, at the start of every one of them. So nothing has been done to address the fundamental thing about how we buy stuff in space. And they have some ideas about that, which I have my opinions on. I'll talk about that at the end about how they're going to buy things. So this just sort of gives you a feeling for that. Recently, you may have heard that the new Secretary of the Air Force, he ended up, and I should have pointed out the org chart, but he ended up merging two organizations that used to be AQS and then another space organization. And he changed it from SP to SQ because he said P stands for policy. And so we need to make sure that's not policy, that's acquisition, so it's SQ. But we're paying special attention to what we use in terms of office codes now because this has gotten to be so contentious. So there's been some merge. I'll show you some stuff, but there hasn't been a lot of merging because there's still a lot of things going on in different places in space. So next slide. The other thing that's happened, this is part of the thing that the Space Force got blasted on, was all they did was rename the Space and Missile Systems Center to be Space Systems Command. So now it's a field command. So instead of being a center, which is sort of just wording change as far as I can tell. So basically this happened last week, and they gave a bunch of speeches out there and everybody's excited. We posted stuff to their Air Force. I'm going to an Air Force Association meeting. We've updated our Facebook page. I did that. And so we gave pictures of everybody there at the base and so forth. And so they're basically responsible for the same stuff that they used to be responsible. And they're basically at the same place they were before we did all this stuff. So the only thing that's changed basically is that there's a lot of boxes and lines that got moved and new names. So I'm going to show you that next, I think, the next slide. Oh, and this is kind of a joke chart. You may have heard about SMC 2.0, and it basically builds on the success. Now, the problem is, I don't know of anybody except for the generals that thought that SMC 2.0 was a success, including the people that worked at SMC. I had a beer call with them last night, and one of the things that happened, now draw attention to the second line, they flattened the organization. They flattened it and made it deeper at the same time, in my opinion, because what they ended up doing was, it used to be that the PEO was in the Pentagon or he was at the base. It was like the base commander. What happened was they took the 3-star general and they gave all his authority to a bunch of colonels. So they have 3 PEOs at the base, and you'll see the next chart. It's not exactly clear. And I, don't tell this. I love the new guy. He's a great Goot line, but I think he's in charge of like parking lot, space assignment, and the clinic and the O Club, because the programs really don't report to him. So you have a 3-star general there that is not a PEO and not really in charge of acquisition. The other thing they did was they thought that the way to fix this was by, the reason why we are doing a bad job of fielding things on time, on schedule, and on schedule, on time, that work and then don't cost too much, is because our architecture is wrong. That's really not true at all. It has to do with your contracts, management contract. But so the idea was, we're going to re-architect everything. We're going to come up with a new floor plan of how we do space. And so that's his portfolio architect. And we'll talk a little bit more of that at the very end. And so anyway, that's this Program Integration Council has to do with, there's like 7 organizations that actually do space acquisition. So they're going to have meetings every once in a while and to talk about that, and then somehow get on the same thing. You can read the words. There's actually more proper words about to describe that in those 2 bullets. So ensuring the planning, execution, alignment, people that have independent budgets, independent priorities, independent ideas, and then we're going to integrate it all together through a series of meetings. Next slide. So this is the new org chart, and you can see what happened was they had to put a little mark by the commander, the 3-star. So he's sort of like integrating things. Typically seated contractors do that, and you know all about seated contractors. And then all the star stuff, that's where all the responsibilities are down lower. So they have a PEO for these 3 enterprise corps, and these other people have like real jobs. So I'm not exactly clear, and it's not even clear this is really going to stand. This was briefed 3 weeks ago at an AFCEA conference or AFCEA meeting where they tried to talk about this. Lots of dotted lines, too many boxes. We didn't really flatten anything, in my opinion, because what you have is this whole architecture thing, which lays on top of everything. And the Service Acquisition Executive, that has yet to be, confirmed by the Senate. I think they have a name now, but that person is not even on the books yet. So, and that's the person who's going to approve all the big programs. And that's that SAE box off the soft side of the Secretary of the Air Force. So this is kind of what the new organization looks like. Not clear whether Mike Gutlein, the new 3-star, is going to keep this or not. I know there's lots of people lobbying him to not do this, because one of the things you'll notice in this org chart, there are no more program offices anymore. So contractors that have programs, they don't know where to go. So when they briefed this slide at the AFCEA thing about 2.5 weeks ago, somebody asked, well, who can we talk to about to get, like, who do we talk to now? And who can get more information? And so this is like the beginning of August. And the guy goes and he says, well, I'm leaving. I put this together and I'm PCSing. So I would say I would save that question for industry days, which is in October. So that's when we're going to find out who the people talk to over there. But it's very, very interesting, very difficult to figure out what's going on. Next slide. This is the last slide I want to show. And now this slide looks really, really blurry and all that. And you see somebody's back of their head in it. So this slide was briefed last week by by the deputy of space operations, General D.T. Thompson, who's a really good guy, Air Force Academy grad, super smart, and an astro major and all that. And so he said, well, I'm going to show this slide. It's not approved for public release yet, but I'm sure that you guys can figure out how to get a copy. So like nearly everybody in the auditorium stood up and took a picture of this thing. I'm going to walk you through it because this is the way they're going to do space from now on. Now, the first thing, it all starts at the top there, top left, with this thing called the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, which the HAC is refusing to fund right now, the House Appropriations Committee, because they think it's duplicative. And the question is, what exactly does it do? And so what happens is the Air Force or the Space Force now, and they pick apart the words why they didn't like it, like duplicate. They're doing on this duplication thing. I think the problem is much bigger than duplication. So this is this organization in the Pentagon. What they're going to do is warfighting design. So they're going to design the force, right? And figure out and look at all the S&T and figure out what kind of force do we need to win in space and do all the things we need to do. And then it goes to the people that put together requirements documents and money stuff. And this is another Pentagon thing. By the way, the more things that are done in the Pentagon, the more screwed up things are going to be. So already we have 2 steps of this process inside the Beltway, where the laws of physics and common sense do not apply, as you probably know from if anybody's lived there. And the most important thing is to make sure you read the Washington Post every morning. So that's what they're doing up at the top. So they synchronize and they deliver and all these kind of things. You can read out the actions. And then what they do is they give this over to this next group of people, the Space Acquisition Force. And you look at all these people on this thing. Any group that has more than like 2 or 3 people on it, I'm not exactly sure how we're going to get consensus out of a group with that many people on it. And they have subgroups. And you look at all these people, they're fairly big organizations. So they're going to decide kind of who gets to do what and who buys what. Then Space Systems Command, aka Space, they're going to streamline all this stuff and then connect it together and buy stuff and integrate it. And then the Star Command people, Starcom, they're going to go off and test it, make sure it works, and then we start over again. The problem with this is that that you have an existing whole space infrastructure up there already. And so any change to do anything sort of has to take into account the fact you have already something there. And some of these things are not going to be delivered for 5 or 10 years. So they're like in the process of being built. So they're sort of trying to change things while it's being built by starting out with a brand new warfighting analysis. Is here's how we're going to win the war, which is essentially like a clean sheet of paper kind of a thing. And so the problem, I was talking to AJ about this, you have to take into fact when you do this, what are you really going to do? You have a couple options. You can just wipe the slate clean, start over. You can modify existing things or stop doing certain things and just insert a couple new things. But all that strategy about how I go off and do something is like it's not been thought out. Like when you're in your house, like doing remodeling, do you just level the house and start over? I mean, that's a plan. Maybe you just do, I'm going to do the bathroom now. Maybe just one bathroom because it's freaking expensive if you've ever done a bathroom. Just the fixtures alone are several $1,000s. I mean, so and all these things. So others, I talked to some people last night who remain nameless, Jim Horish, who basically told me the way they're going to do the new GPS is they're going to stop funding GPS 3F, what they just awarded, and then they're going to go build a bunch of LEO satellites and really quick and put them up there. And that's how, and we're going to use the new frequency, 5 gigahertz for the downlink. So this is, by the way, reality will catch up with these guys. Yeah. The minute they propose any of these grandiose ideas, the question is, and whenever you do something new, it costs money. And it's not like, well, I guess we are printing a lot of money lately because it's just 3.5 trillion for infrastructure. Oh, what the heck? Let's just do another 3.5 trillion for space while we're at it. While the printing press is running. But the problem you get into is that how do you really do this? And we have programs like GPS. We've been waiting over 20 years just for a new GPS M-code receiver.
Right.
Look at OCX.
Right.
I mean, I was there. We awarded that contract 2008. Still, yeah. There's an article in Defense News. We're gonna deliver that thing in 2022 now. You know, it's like, wow. By hell or by God. So, wow. So that's kind of where it's at. Yeah. A lot of good thought has gone into it, but it remains to be seen how this is all really gonna going to turn
Thank you
out.
so much, Rick, for your very unique perspective, which is incredibly well informed. We have a lot of requests for your slides. We'll provide them on a non-attribution basis. Is that okay with you, Rick?
There are no dirty words on any of these slides.
Okay.
And most of what I said had nothing to do with the
Great.
slides.
Great. So if I can summarize this, I think the message is it's not Star Trek, but it's Steve Carell's Space Force on Netflix that we're headed more towards, perhaps.
Yes. And you notice that show got canceled. So
Right. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Rick.